If you were to ask me, who do I believe is the least qualified source of information on the justice system in the United States, I would probably tell you Smug, late night talk show host.
We love prisons so much, a shocking number of Americans are currently inside one, as we learned last week during a House Judiciary Committee hearing.
Our nation now has the greatest number of prisoners of any country in the world. Nearly 1 in every 100 adults in America is in prison or jail.
This guy is greatly exaggerating the incarceration rate in the United States. He's basically saying that 1% of the population is currently in prison. That is not true. In fact, only 0.004% of the population in the United States is currently imprisoned. That's less than half of what this guy said.
That's true. We have over 2 million people behind bars right now.
No, what that guy said was completely untrue. And so is that 2 million number that you're throwing around, although it's not far off. There are currently 1.5 million people who are incarcerated in prisons in the United States. If you include people who are in jails, that number goes up to 1.7 million.
We have more prisoners at the moment than China. We don't have more of anything than China, other than, of course, debt to China.
I don't see why so many people think that China should have more prisoners than the United States just because China is an authoritarian country. Yes, China is authoritarian, but it does not have a rule of law. If a citizen is a victim of a crime and they call the police in China, the police aren't going to do anything about it unless the person complaining is some sort of influential person. That is why there is so much corruption in China. The government doesn't care if its citizens commit crimes against each other. It basically just ignores it. That's why the environment is so bad in China, because the officials are corrupt. The people who are supposed to be enforcing the environmental regulations will take bribes or just look the other way. In China, when people commit crimes, they aren't generally held accountable for it. Contrast this with the United States, where people generally follow the law. And if someone breaks the law, they are held accountable for it. It doesn't matter if that person is a police officer or government official. Everyone has to follow the law in the United States. And that's what makes the criminal justice system in the US so much better than the one in China.
And it didn't always used to be this way. Our prison population has expanded 8-fold since 1970. The only other thing that's grown at that rate since the 70s is varieties of Cheerios. F*** you, Fruity Cheerios!
Well, no, John, that's not the only thing that's grown during that period of time. The US population since that period of time has grown by around 50%. And it was in 1964 that we passed the current immigration law that greatly expanded the number of immigrants who were able to legally come to our country. This also coincides with the period of time in which we stopped enforcing our borders and mass illegal immigration into the United States was able to occur, as well as mass drug smuggling.
You trumped up Fruit Loops and you know it! And look, our prison population has exploded for a number of reasons, from the dismantling of our mental health system to mandatory minimum sentence laws, which...
It's intellectually lazy to just blame mandatory minimum sentence for a high incarceration rate. But why don't you think critically about it for a second? Why do certain offenses have mandatory minimum sentences? Well, let me pose this thought to you. Imagine that you work for a company and due to your position, you are in a position where you could covertly embezzle $100,000 from the company. Now, what's to stop you from doing that? Well, you would probably be stopped by fear of punishment. But what if there was no mandatory minimum sentence for embezzling $100,000? Well, you might as well take your chances and embezzle that money. If you end up getting caught and there's no mandatory minimum sentence, then you'll probably just get probation. And $100,000 for a chance of probation, that's not going to be an effective deterrent.
To help explain why 97% of people plead guilty to federal crimes rather than risk going to trial to, of course, drugs. Because half the people in federal prison are there on drug charges, and it accounts for 1/4 of admissions to state prisons. And of course...
Well, first of all, if the issue that you are talking about is the incarceration rate in the United States, I don't see why you would give a shit what the ratio was of drug offenders versus non-drug offenders in the federal prison. The reason I say this is that there are only 200,000 people in federal prisons versus 1.3 million in state prisons. So the federal prison system just really doesn't have much of an impact on incarceration rate. Secondly, that 25.4% number that you came up with was either cherry-picked or came from some weird source, because according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the percent of people locked up in U.S. prisons for drug crimes is only 15.2%.
Of course, it's tricky to know how to feel about all this because, on the one hand, the war on drugs has completely solved our nation's drug problem, so that's good.
As long as the border between Mexico and the United States remains unsecured, there will always be drug smuggling, there will always be a high drug addiction rate in the United States, there will always be a large drug supply, and there will always be a lot of crime and a very high incarceration rate. The war of drugs cannot be won if law enforcement in the United States are not able to go where the drug dealers operate.
But on the other hand, our drug laws do seem to be a little draconian and a lot racist. Because while white people and African Americans use drugs about the same amount, a study has found that African Americans have been sent to prison for drug offences at up to 10 times the rate for some utterly known reason.
So what you are trying to imply is that the drug laws are just being used as a pretext to arrest and incarcerate black people. However, if you look at the prison population, 14.4% of black prisoners are in prison due to a drug crime, which is pretty similar to the rate of white prisoners. 15.1% of white prisoners are in prison for a drug crime. So the real reason that black people are more likely to be incarcerated due to drug crimes is because they commit these crimes at a higher rate. Not that they are targeted by police more.
It reminds me of a joke. You know, black people who commit drug offences, they go to jail like this, whereas white people don't go to jail at all.
Well, I guess you and your audience find that joke to be pretty funny, but it's not something that I would make light of.
In fact, so many people are incarcerated in America right now that it's become one of the things that Sesame Street has to explain to children.
My dad's in jail.
When I was about your age, my dad was incarcerated too. Incarcerated is when someone breaks the law, a grown-up rule, and then they have to go to jail or prison.
We will be your friend. We'll help you through. You're not alone.
Just think about that. We now need adorable singing puppets to explain prison to children in the same way they explain the number 7 or what the moon is.
In the early part of our country's history, we didn't send criminals to prison. We pretty much executed people for almost every crime. If you committed an armed robbery, you were hung. It's only in our more recent history that we began to imprison people. But of course, John Oliver just glosses over this and acts like it's wildly implausible that our society would imprison people.
And at least Sesame Street is actually talking about prison. The rest of us are much happier completely ignoring it, perhaps because it's so easy not to care about prisoners. They are, by definition, convicted criminals. In fact, it's so easy not to care that we are really comfortable making jokes about one of the most horrifying things that can potentially happen to them.
You've made this entire video making jokes about people going to prison. You even made a joke about black people going to prison at a higher rate. And now you're going to lecture people for doing the exact same thing?
Go directly to jail. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. And do not, I repeat, do not drop the soap.
Look, doubloons. Don't drop them.
You know what? If we were in prison, you guys would be like my bitches.
We're going to federal pound me in the ass prison.
Plus, you got any idea what they do to eggs in San Ricardo prison? It ain't over easy.
Do you get it? Do you get it?
Yeah, I can tell you're laughing, John, because you're a fucking hypocrite.